We hear a lot about I am, consciousness, awareness, and we may, if as a seeker reading about consciousness, hearing references to consciousness, it's quite possible that we don't have a frame of reference as to what that is, what is being referred to. It's just part of our thinking. We sometimes don't think, what does a certain word mean? We hear it, and because we hear it a lot, we think, oh, well, it must mean something. So we think we know, but maybe we have just got a place for the word consciousness. And so I think it's important to maybe try and point in different ways as to what is meant by consciousness and awareness. And one of the ways of doing that is to create a thought experiment that creates a certain image and contrasts no consciousness and then the presence of consciousness. And when you look at the difference between the two and know that what is being created in the thought experiment is the inclusion of consciousness from a point where there is no consciousness. And then when you look at and see what has been included and know that that is what is being referred to as consciousness, or that the example is trying to point at what consciousness is, then that can help create a better idea, a better notion of what is referred to when the word consciousness is used. Now, bearing in mind, words, including the word consciousness, can be used in different ways. So what I'm going to put forward now is hopefully going to reveal what one of the uses of the word consciousness is. And it's particularly linked to I am and awareness. So when we become aware of our own consciousness and inquire into it, think about it, contemplate on it, we might start to be curious about where it came from, and isn't it quite an amazing thing that it's here? But before we have that sense of awe or that sense of curiosity, we first need to appreciate that it's here. And what tends to have happened as part of the human development is that consciousness is here, and yet it is so much a given. It just appears, it's always there. We don't have to do anything. We don't need to fix it or make it happen. And so we don't give it much attention. I guess a bit like air in life. We're always able to breathe. The air is always there. It's a hugely important component, but because we've never found ourselves without it, it's taken for granted. And if in an instant the air supply was cut off, that's when we realize how important it is. And in fact, how thankful we could be if we paid attention, how thankful we could be that we have air, because it is so crucial. And yet, when we take it for granted because we don't find ourselves without air, we ignore it. And so consciousness, our consciousness, is a bit like that. So let's imagine life before life. So the universe in its basic forms, in its early forms, where no life exists. So we will assume that there is a universe of space and substances, and let's say some planets, like planet Earth, has formed, and it's floating around in space or rotating around the sun. But there's no life on Earth. And so in this example, there is a physical set of conditions, but no consciousness aware of the rocks and, well, let's just keep it at rocks, maybe some water. So there's water and rocks, and no consciousness aware of it. No consciousness to be aware of the world of form. And then let's just, for contrast's sake, say a human spontaneously appears on Earth out of nowhere, which on the assumption that this is a physical universe that's unrealistic, but for the purpose of the example, a human being suddenly appears, and for the first time there is consciousness of the rocks and the water. There is a sense of awareness with a personal, or with a sense of existence there. I exist and I am aware. Now I'm not talking about the human being that says, oh, this is interesting, that's a rock, or that's something, and I am here. It's even before cognition. So I'm using the human simply to demonstrate the human essentially as a vehicle through which consciousness is functioning. So we don't need to worry about the thinking aspects of the human being, the preferences and the emotions and all of that. Simply the act of being, or the function of awareness of the rocks, whereas prior to the appearance of the human being, there were the rocks and the water, but nothing aware of it. Now, some of you might be listening to it and going, oh no, you've got it all wrong. Advaita tells us that awareness is not of the body. Awareness is, or consciousness is not of the human being or the body, but it is the container in which the rocks appear. And so even before human beings appeared on planet Earth, there would have been awareness. Now, who knows? That's not my point. I'm not saying that there was no consciousness prior to human beings. But in this example, we're saying there is no consciousness. There is just the physical planet and rocks and water. And let's say wind, and so the water ripples and some evaporation happens and the rocks get eroded. So the course of time carries on and change happens on the surface on physical levels. But up to that point, we are assuming that there has never been any consciousness to be aware of the world. So once again, I'll repeat, the point of this exercise is simply so that using the thought experiment, we can have a contrast that points out what consciousness, what awareness is. So hopefully you can envisage a world with no consciousness. So we can contemplate that there could be a rock and water, but with nothing aware of it. Ever. There's never been any consciousness. So the world has existed for, let's say, 100 million years in that state, or 10 minutes, 10 days, whatever. But never has there been any consciousness to be aware of what exists, or what existed for that period of time. And then we are inserting, in the example, a human being, and then we now know, we know that the human being has a faculty, has a function, there is awareness of the world. And so consciousness functioning through the human being, and it's not even so important to insist that consciousness is of the human being. In fact, it can be useful to question whether consciousness is of the human being. Once again, that's not really the point. What the point of the example is to introduce the fact that there was no awareness of what is, and then awareness or consciousness comes in and is aware of the world. And that maybe might allow us to become aware in an instant, right now, of the consciousness that is here now. The consciousness that is a world aware of this present moment. This is the consciousness that sages and or physicists, scientists are trying to let's say physicists and scientists are interested now in trying to understand consciousness. And, after having done a lot of experiments and observation, there aren't any definitive answers about what it is or where it comes from. And that's not so important. Some people are going to find it interesting to do experiments on consciousness and how it relates to the brain and all of that. What's important is to be aware of the consciousness that is here now. That as a spiritual seeker, and as part of the seeking, so many of the teachings are actually completely dedicated to creating an awakening by consciousness of consciousness, by the consciousness that is here, that is aware of the table and the chairs and the trees and the other people and the body of the human being, and yet that consciousness hasn't landed on itself. Consciousness aware of itself by itself. And it doesn't require thinking. Consciousness or awareness is different. It's a different function. It's a different movement to thought. The act of being aware, or awareness, isn't something that has to be done. It's always happening. You'll notice as soon as there is waking up in the morning, by default, consciousness is there. And when we wake up in the morning, we don't say, here is consciousness. Consciousness being just consciousness being itself, which is by default aware of what is. We tend to get up and go straight into thinking, and the fact that there is consciousness is largely irrelevant to us as far as our priorities go. And the reason that it's irrelevant to us is that what is relevant is where we are going to get, where we want to get, how we're going to get there, what we're going to gain today, how we're going to defend ourselves, protect ourselves, and what happened in the past and what will happen in the future. And so what has been prioritized by the way that we have developed is a sort of a strategy, modus operandi of related to outcomes. And so that means that as life unfolds through the day, sometimes outcomes we want, we're cooking and the food is good, or we're cooking and the food is not good. A friend sends us a message that is nice or not nice. We get news about a work project that we want or we don't want. The news is either good news or bad news. So all the way throughout the day, there are outcomes. We're driving and someone is aggressive on the road, or in the supermarket, they're impolite, or all of daily life is about a series of outcomes, one after another, after another, after another. And because we've prioritized, we wake up in the morning and it's about how we feel and what is going to make us feel better, and basically pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And that is what we think is important to who we are. That means that life is really about what outcomes happen. And so we spend a lot of time worrying about the outcomes and being annoyed and resenting and regretting what has happened. So blaming the other for how they have acted in the past, blaming ourselves for how we've acted in the future, worrying about the future, or having ideas about when life will be okay. And that's a whole lot of thinking that has to happen if we don't prioritize things that are outside of the flow of life. If our priority is about the flow of life, we are going to be focused on what has happened and what might happen and what is happening in terms of outcomes. If we start to awaken to the consciousness that is functioning right now, here and now, and maybe even ask yourself, well, where did this consciousness come from? It might be a result of evolution. The consciousness might, if you don't believe teachings that say it is this, and I advise that at some point it's good to question the teachings or the truth, in quotes, that say it is this. So if you don't say, oh, that book told me that consciousness is not of the body, then in your inquiry you say, well, maybe it is of the body. And that's pretty impressive, that the body is aware, that the body has created a complexity to be aware. Or maybe it's got nothing to do with the body and the consciousness is from outside, and it's sort of looking in as a spectator, a witness of everything that is being created inside of it, essentially. And when we think about this, we might start to realize what's really important is that I am. That without the consciousness that is here, that is aware of the world, aware of the problems if there are problems, then there isn't anything. Not there is absolutely nothing for anyone. But relative to the seeker that is looking for happiness in this life, a seeker that is looking to know themselves more truly, to connect to something deeper, to their true self, to the essence that is what we are, then it makes sense for us to realize that none of the ups and downs, none of the past and the future exist in a way that is registered as we register each moment of our life without I am, without consciousness being here. And dropping back into consciousness, meaning if there has been an awakening to the consciousness that is here now, and in that shift there is essentially a silent being that, then we know that there is no need for thinking in being. The consciousness is able to just rest in its own beingness and be aware of what is, the totality of what is, which includes the changing content, including the thoughts and the emotions, and simultaneously also be aware of the fact that there is awareness of everything. And it is essentially dropping back into a seat that is beyond the flow of life and not separate from the flow of life, but it's sort of a step back compared to when there is a full involvement in the flow of life and the body trying to get somewhere. And so knowing or being that silent awareness, that beingness, means that at any point if we find ourselves getting carried away with feeling annoyed, being overly involved in what is happening in the outcomes, we can always just remember, but I am. That is what is really impressive, is that I exist right now, that there is awareness of circumstance. And so the more that we drop into this being and realize how impressive it is that there is consciousness aware right now, the more that is a practice or a remembering that happens, the more when suffering, when involvement in outcomes happens, and there is essentially a disconnection from beingness, the more familiar we have been with our own beingness, the more likely the thought is, actually I am, which is really saying, actually, what is more important than how so-and-so is acting or what might happen as a result of these actions or my choices. What is more important is that I am. So we're actually remembering the fundamental essence that makes life known to us or allows us to know life in the first place. And because essentially we could say consciousness is all there is, when we see that without consciousness there would be no experience of the world from our perspective, then we might appreciate that my whole life is dependent on this consciousness, is not separate from the consciousness. So all there is consciousness, really. that is the fundamental, the most fundamental aspect of the momentary experience, the life experience, which is always only an experience known now. Known now by the consciousness that is functioning in this moment, that is aware. And that consciousness, when it wakes up to itself, realizes that it's a formless, it's not a physical thing, it is a formless awareness and a sense of beingness. And there are a lot of deepenings that happen, a lot of realizations that happen as there is a deepening into consciousness, including ultimately the fear of death. Not necessarily a lack of fear of death in the way that we think about it, because someone might say, oh, well, you say you're not afraid of death. Well, what if I hold on to you by your ankle and hang you off, a 20-story building? Are you telling me you wouldn't be afraid of death? And I'd be petrified. Please don't do it to me. The fear of death is a psychological fear of death when we're not hanging off a building, where the prospect of not being here essentially is like no problem. And part of that comes because as we deepen into this appreciation of awareness, we maybe start exploring the various states, like the dream state compared to the waking state, and the deep sleep state compared to the waking state. And maybe some of you have been under anesthetic, and you think about that in relation to consciousness. And so deep sleep is an example where the consciousness is not active, at least where the content, there is no content for a period of time. In the dream state, there is content. In the waking state, there is content and awareness of the content. In the deep sleep state, there is nothing to be aware of, and therefore even the question of awareness falls away. Now, that was something I spent a lot of time arguing with Ramesh, because I had come to see Ramesh through the process, through a seeking process where it was drummed into me through what I was reading, and for good reason. At a certain phase, it says awareness or consciousness is ever present, even in deep sleep. Now, that's another technique in a way to get us to become aware of what consciousness is. So, in saying it is ever present, it is the background of the three states of the dream state, the waking state, the dream state, and the deep sleep state. Is a teaching or a way of creating another mental picture that allows the awareness of awareness in the waking state to become more apparent, because the thinking has now created an understanding that may not be 100% truthful, but nonetheless is very useful in allowing a separation of awareness and the content, such that the awareness is much more available for it to know itself, to be aware of itself. And so that is done by creating the image of awareness as the unchanging background, even in deep sleep, that there is awareness of deep sleep, awareness of nothing. At another phase along the journey, we can be told that deep sleep is actually the absence of awareness. And the waking state and the dream state is where there is presence of awareness. And so you say, well, which one is true? And the whole point is not about the teachings being true. As a seeker, we start off thinking that I need to know the truth, and often we think of truth as being some sort of knowledge. Knowing, I need to know whether consciousness or awareness is ever present even in deep sleep, or whether it is absent in deep sleep, that deep sleep is the absence of consciousness. It's irrelevant. What is really relevant is to be aware of the consciousness that is here now, which has nothing to do with knowledge. It is a direct knowing of awareness or consciousness functioning in this moment as that which is aware of what is, the totality of what is. So a sound, a barking sound, for example, or bird chirping, or car honking, is generally felt as though it is outside of what I am, because we have become so identified with the physical aspects of the human being. And so the sound, relative to the physical aspect, is outside. As we know ourselves as consciousness or awareness, it becomes evident that everything that arises in this moment is inside the awareness. If it were outside the awareness, it would not be known. And so this is a shift that is inspired or requires a recognition of the very consciousness that is functioning right here, and a resting, a dropping into that consciousness, being that may allow an appreciation of the fact that everything is happening within that field of consciousness. That consciousness is the container in which everything arises and subsides. And furthermore, that everything that arises and subsides is fundamentally not separate from consciousness, and in fact, therefore made of consciousness. So what we thought was made of wood and stone and metal and sound waves and light waves, when appreciated as an arising within the field of consciousness and not separate from that field of consciousness, all of the content is transformed into ultimately being not separate and made of consciousness itself. And therefore we can realize that all there is consciousness. All this predicated on instant, which can happen for anyone right now, because consciousness is ever present, especially in the waking state. In the waking state, it is undeniable. I am aware, and I am. And if we don't stop and think about it, well, it's not really about, we start off by thinking about it, by receiving pointers, and at some point it's, don't think about it, just be it. And that is the revelation of the fundamental basis of existence, the fundamental basis of the experience of life. Without consciousness, for all intents and purposes, we could say nothing there is. Without consciousness, nothing is. Now, whether that is absolutely true or relatively true, what we know is that relatively it is correct. That take consciousness away, and your experience of the world, which we could say is the world, collapses. That the world, which really we're referring to your experience of the world, is interdependent on the presence of consciousness. If consciousness is taken away, then all that is, as you experience it, collapses. So the fact that I am is essentially the source of the experience. Without I am, there is no experience. Without awareness, without consciousness, there is no experience. This shift from outcomes to presence is essentially a shift from focusing outwardly to turning inwardly, where consciousness stops looking outwardly at outcomes and turns inwardly to know itself. This turning inwardly is simply a shift in focus, a shift in attention, such that it becomes aware of that which is always here, always has been here. And that's sometimes why liberation is said to not be something that you have to go anywhere for. It's not something that you have to do. It's not something you gain. It is a realization of what has always been here. Now, at this point, I'd make a distinction between awakening and liberation. What I've been speaking about, where consciousness becomes aware of itself, is essentially the awakening of consciousness to consciousness, which is different to liberation. Liberation is the end of suffering, a very practical thing, the end of an uncomfortableness with oneself, and that is very much dependent on a deepening of the appreciation that what we are is consciousness, or rather that a very significant aspect of the human being is the consciousness that is functioning right here, right now, and always has been. So awakening leads to liberation. I don't think that when someone has awakened that they are liberated. It's very clear by looking at the process of many seekers that there is awakening and the ability to describe, sometimes quite beautifully, the consciousness, and yet the suffering, the uncomfortableness with life carries on. And that's why it's very important, I think, for teachings to also introduce the notion that what is it that we're really looking for? We're not looking to know consciousness. Really, at the end of the day, we're looking for something very practical. We're looking for peace of mind in daily living. And that peace of mind is heavily interdependent on the knowing of ourself as consciousness. But that is a result, it's a deliverance, it's a deepening of the appreciation, such that in the end, life is not about outcomes. Life is not about what we do and what the other does. life is able to be seen as a happening, and there is simultaneously not only the witnessing of life as a happening, but the non-arising of the thinking mind, which usually takes the place of guilt. It takes the form of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation. There's a Zen saying that says awakening is spontaneous and deliverance is gradual. So the moment that awareness becomes aware of itself is a spontaneous, out of time realization. And often it's a glimpse, and then it seems very elusive for a while. And hopefully what happens, it's that starts to become more and more familiar. That glimpse leads to a resting in being, where it becomes more and more accessible until eventually we find ourselves stabilized in that. That in itself is not enough. Because if the thinking patterns of doership and attachment to outcomes remain in the system, then when circumstance presents itself in a way that is quite intense in a painful way, what will happen is that the belief systems, the patterns of being attached to outcomes will then be triggered, because resting in your being does not necessarily uproot those beliefs, unless those beliefs are specifically investigated, that I am not the doer and that life is a happening, that my happiness is not to be found in outcomes. And so this awakening to the consciousness aspect and the investigating of the deeply ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome is a movement that you could say that it's two prongs of the fork, two different pathways that both need to happen. One is a deepening into the essence that we are, and the other is a diminishing of the false ideas of who we thought we were. And if the diminishing of the ideas of who we thought we were hasn't happened, when situation happens in a way that is intensely painful, the old habits will automatically kick in, and we'll find the suffering there, and we'll wonder, why is this suffering coming back? I know myself as formless awareness. I know myself as not the body. And the reason is because the deeply ingrained beliefs that got put in place for many years before the awakening need to be specifically seen, investigated, and dissolved, and that doesn't necessarily happen simply by an appreciation and a recognition of the consciousness that is functioning here. That supports that process. So let's see if we've got any hands up. Hello, Holger.
Hello, Roger.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Good to be here.
Good.
You spoke about the air we breathe and to appreciate it. What about money as a practical aspect of life? Do you have some practical concept on how to look at money? Yeah, that's maybe good enough.
Yes, money is helpful at relieving pressure in relation to material goods that we need or that are pleasurable to us. Obviously, some things we need, shelter, food, and some things we don't need but are pleasurable. And so money makes life easier. There's little doubt about that. suffering kicks in when we feel like that is where my happiness is to be found.
Okay, but then there is a basic level where you just need to cover for shelter and clothing and food.
Yes, and so Ramesh used to say this teaching, most spiritual teachings, all spiritual teachings actually, are really there for those people who have their basic needs covered. Because if you didn't have your basic needs covered, and someone started talking to you about, are you happy in life, and all this, they say, listen, I'm spending my days trying to get enough money together to keep myself and my family alive. I don't have time to think about whether I'm happy or not. I'm that is my priority, and that's a very practical. Um, I think a lot of people might not appreciate that is actually how it would work. Now there are people below the poverty line, like sadhus and whatever in India, but when you look at it, they have their needs taken care of more or less. They're not starving and dying on the streets. If they were, they probably would be forced to take up some other movement that would biologically prevent them from dying. So it's about priorities, and we tend to be, biologically designed to make sure that our basic needs are first looked after. And once that's the case, then we might start asking questions about happiness.
In regard to business, I just have this old conditioning or this idea that I feel like I'm a part of a dysfunctional machine that just destroys this planet. It's just an old idea in my system, and it makes it hard for me just to find joy in just charging and going after projects and increasing my income. I'm rather on the passive side.
Um, well, I don't know what to say. Um,
Yeah, me neither. But I have a very nice life. I mean, it's beautiful and it's quite amazing how everything is working.
mm-hmm.
But I couldn't explain it, but that's maybe not the point at all.
Mm.
Just thank you.
Yes, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Good, thank you.
Hi, sorry.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
It was great. Today's satsang was absolutely beautifully done. I can't thank you enough. The
Good.
way you just described it, it's just the best thing ever for me. Yeah, just knowing the awareness, being aware of the consciousness, and then you are also touching up on, figuring out about like these reactions that are happening. The guilt is coming back, the uncomfortable feelings, and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And then realizing that it is not the same. Like sometimes I doubt myself. Am I really there? I think I am. But then why am I being uncomfortable again? Why do I feel guilty again about this action or whatever it is that I feel?
Mm-hmm.
And then when you speak about it, it is just so clear. And I just wanted to thank you and say that you know how to talk about it. And it is great that you do this. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. Now, is there anything, I know that because of conditioning for all of these years that we keep going back to those feelings and to those reactions.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I'm not the doer and I have to just wait and hopefully it will happen that at some point I don't react that way or I don't feel the guilt anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But is there anything else that it might help me remember to be or to rest in the being, so that I remind myself not to be uncomfortable because it wasn't my doing, it was just a happening. And it does happen more often, but not as often as I would like it to be.
Well, one thing I'll mention here, which can become part of your up-to-date conditioning, so it's new conditioning that can become part of your up-to-date conditioning, and then at some point in the future, certain thoughts might arise, certain rememberings might arise that can cut off the suffering, and that is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning being whatever it is at that point in time, which may include what I'm about to talk about. So that's an explanation of how even the remembering is not someone's doing, but rather a happening according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning, which is how everyone is always functioning. One thing that I would suggest is that it's very important for us to have some sort of appreciation, reasoning, and rationale as to suffering being not of our true nature, right? Suffering being of the mistake or of the misunderstanding. So essentially that means that whenever suffering arises, there can be a relationship to the suffering thought, the guilt, the blame, the expectation, the worry, a relationship that says this is misunderstanding. Now that's very different from a relationship that says I reject this, I don't want it to be here, it shouldn't be here. So it's not about there being a resistance to it. There is an appreciation. Yes, it is arising because we are aware of it. There is the blame, let's say, or there is the guilt, or there is the expectation, there is the worry, shame, lack of self-worth, any of those forms of suffering. So we say, yes, it is there. That is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And I know though I know that suffering, even though it's there, it is of misunderstanding. It is not of my true nature. So why this is important is before we become aware that all suffering is coming from essentially the mistaken beliefs of who we are, before we relate to it that way, the default is that we are relating to it as if it is true. That is the default position. And that's why it has become so habituated. That's why it has become so ingrained, because we are convinced that the other is the doer, I am the doer, my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and therefore when the other does something that hurts me, I have to hate them. When I do something that delivers not a great result, I have to hate myself. I have to have all these expectations about life being perfect, 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 pleasure, 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 as a result of me functioning perfectly and the other functioning perfectly. We have to have all these regrets about the past, all based on the deeply ingrained belief that my ways of knowing myself and my ways of seeing life are true. And so this teaching is essentially dedicated to pointing out that suffering is what can end. Suffering is a result of the deeply ingrained beliefs of I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in outcomes. and essentially pointing out that this is not true, that a connection to the deeper part of ourself is always available without anything being different, without any outcomes being needed. So we can essentially be who we are now, and that means we don't need outcomes to be who we are. And eventually we find that being who we are, resting in presence, means no thinking mind, and that is our happiness, which we will know from our own experience when we see that in being, in presence, the thinking mind is absent. So essentially, the more that we can appreciate that whenever suffering happens, yes, it's happening because of what is deeply ingrained in the system, but it is of ignorance, and that is a way that there'll be a motivation for us not to get completely lost and involved in that thinking, because it means that some part of us is stepping out of it. If it's not seen as ignorance or misunderstanding, then there's a chance that we get, which is the normal position, we get fully involved in it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So that for me...
may I ask...
Go
ahead.
No, you ask what you were going to ask.
No, I was just going to ask if these recordings are going to be available on YouTube, because I see that they are not like before. Before, as soon as it was done on a Saturday, then within 2-3 days, it was up on YouTube. But now I don't see them as often coming up. I was just wondering.
Yeah, I don't follow necessarily a specific formula. They sort of, some of them get put up depending on how tomorrow and next week unfolds. So I'll try and put today's one up, given you said it was useful. And so at least
yes,
I'll make an effort, try and make an effort, or I'll make an effort, and let's see if it happens.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rod.
You're welcome. So in my seeking, I remember it was really important for me to have this appreciation that suffering was not of my true self, my essence. The consciousness doesn't have these thoughts of doership and attachment to outcome. Those are thoughts of the thinking mind that are based on very specific conditioning that has been set in place as part of the development of the human being. And as we drop into being, we can see the contrast between the thinking mind and the peace outside of the thinking mind when we drop into being. So this appreciation of seeing all the different forms of suffering, becoming familiar with them, and then when they arise, identifying them, sort of having almost like a radar that knows, there it is. It's happening, and it is not of my true nature, which means more and more pulling the plug, let's say, not giving it a feedback loop of energy for it to persist. Hi, Liz.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hi. Nice to see you. Can I just ask you a question about an experience I had a little while ago? I've been trying to talk to you, but I'm in Australia and I usually fall asleep by question time, so I'm quite pleased to have stayed awake, and I hope this memory is still fresh in my mind. Is that okay?
Yes, sure.
Okay. I was just, I don't know, doing things in the kitchen, I think. And then something happened, or it all happened perhaps just in a couple of seconds, I think. It didn't take long, but a lot happened. And I felt there were several characters, and I was observing something from a distance, looking down, as though I was in like an opera box at the theatre, looking down, and there was a small figure wailing, crying, very, 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 very distressed, and sort of lying on her stomach, I think. But then there was another larger figure standing beside her, wanting to go to comfort her, but frightened of all the wailing. And then it did feel like a theatre, because I looked at the head beside me, and there was and I could also feel the distress of the person watching a wailing person, or child, I think it was. So I felt the fear, I felt the sadness and the fear of the sadness, and then this very still presence beside me, like a large head, very, very calm, feeling nothing, just observing, very peaceful. And I was that as well, no colour to it, sort of grey and cloudy. And then me, then it came around to me. That person was on my left, and then it came around to me, and I just said, "Oh, that's funny," and carried on. But I kept coming back to it, thinking it was so clear and memorable that I keep coming back to it, and probably trying to remember it so I could ask you about it. So it's really stuck with me. Does it make any sense to you? Because I felt everything. I felt it all. I was all those people, and it took about 2 seconds.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm darling. Yeah. Oh, excuse me, my husband's worried. I'm on Zoom. I'm talking to somebody on Zoom. Okay. Yeah.
Good. What we can say is it was an experience, I would say a peak experience, because there's probably a lot to be learnt out of it or recognized out of it. It could be a representation of change that's happening in the system. I think that these experiences tend to happen when the old structure changes a little bit or a lot. I would say that it's a creation in a way. It's a recreation. That's what all experience really is. A creation, and the question is, what is it showing us? What is it revealing? And I'd say it's revealing aspects of oneself that, as you described it, it is revealing a lot of different aspects, maybe of Liz, in a way that seems like different people or different characters, but may actually be all different aspects of the one character. And that's a way that it can be demonstrated, that there are all of these aspects in Liz or as part of Liz. Or you can disregard that part of it and focus on the calm awareness that was detached. That's a significant component which sort of was demonstrated to you in a way that is very experiential. So you have a sense of it, you had a feeling of it, rather than just someone talking about awareness that is witnessing and at peace and not involved. You actually had the experience of that, if I'm not mistaken, from what you've described.
I did.
Yeah. And so that's an example of how there can be a witnessing. And in fact, the awareness aspect of the human being as part of the disidentification with outcomes, essentially. There usually is a phase where the witnessing is quite detached, and that is a phase of part of the deepening, part of the disidentification, and it doesn't necessarily remain that extreme and that with that particular qualitative nature. It morphs into something else, but it's very important to have an experience or get a sense that awareness is, in a way, the witness, and is doesn't have to be involved. That our experience, where there is usually full involvement in our thoughts, our emotions, what is happening, that's not the only way. And so those experiences can be a revelation of things like that.
It was. Okay, that's giving me something more to think about. Can I ask one more question about
Yep.
the thinking mind? I couldn't remember what it was. The thinking mind.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard you say sometimes that if we sort of prayed to God and said, "Oh, please take my, please remove my thinking," we would be like hopeless. But surely you mean we can lose our thinking mind, but only the thinking mind. We can keep the working mind, but the thinking mind can drop right away.
Yes.
The muttering sort of mind that can be peeled off.
Yeah. And the reason I say that is because an earlier teaching usually talks about how thinking is the problem. And when an earlier teaching talks about thinking as the problem, they're not so worried about semantics. They're more worried about the habitual thinking of the thinking mind, and pointing out that, and pointing out that is the problem, that is the uncomfortableness, and in fact, wanting to encourage a resting in being, which is outside of both the thinking and the working mind, at least for a period of time. And so a seeker can get into their head, which can be useful for a while, that thinking is the problem, and that if only we were free of thought. And that's encouraging, or that's useful, because it means that seeker is going to have the thought more and more often, ironically, a thought, when they're lost in suffering and involved in thinking, that just says, thinking is the problem, stop. And that has the potential to shift them out of thinking into being. And that's part of the deepening. If a seeker is convinced thinking is the problem and that our freedom lies outside of thinking, they are going to drop into a place of no thought more and more regularly, which is a form of, let's say, meditation, or resting in being. At some point, that lack of distinction needs to be corrected, and that's why we introduced the notion of the thinking mind versus the working mind, because the truth is that liberated sages were not at all free of the faculty of thought. They were free of the faculty of the thinking mind, which is suffering thought. And if a seeker continues to indefinitely think that liberation is the end of thinking, what can often get impaired is their working mind function, where there is no interest in even the working mind being considered valid. Now, for as long as that, so there is a period, as I said, where that is useful, that is helpful, because it strengthens the the beingness aspect. It does very little for specifically looking at what the thinking mind is made up of. It does very little at conceptualizing and putting words onto the thinking mind as being based on the belief of doership and the belief of attachment to outcome. And so, as I said in the satsang, if that never gets elaborated on and the thinking doesn't specifically investigate the suffering thoughts and then dissolve them through a seeing of them and an understanding of them and a confirming of that being the case in your own experience, etc., then what is likely to happen is the person is going to find themselves flip-flopping, where there are periods when they are resting in presence and being, and then circumstance happen and they get propelled out of that into suffering again. And so to diminish the flip-flopping process, eventually the contemplation has to shift from just being a resting in being into a dissolving of the thinking mind thoughts, which means that the thinking mind has to be highlighted, and when we're highlighting the thinking mind, we then have to sort of say, and thoughts about working out certain things, certain practical aspects, are not anything to do with your suffering, and they don't disturb peace of mind. But if that comes in too early, it might, or for some people, part of that being useful, the elaboration between working mind and thinking mind, first requires a resting in being to have set in.
Okay. After following one of your satsangs, I think following somebody's question, I did quite a lot of I am, maybe too much, or almost like a mantra. Yeah. Because I just got so fed up with my thinking mind. I was just so fed up with it. I wasn't saying stop. I was shouting stop. So I did it all day, and anyway, eventually, that the thing I've tried to do it before, and I just think it's stuck on you. It's like your skin, you cannot get rid of it. It was like skin. Anyway, it peeled off. It just felt like a mandarin peel coming off. It just came off that easily. And since then, the last few days, I've been on being I am quite a lot, but not with a gladness really. There's a certain amount of flatness and sadness to it. I can't understand it. I thought I'd be happy. And the thinking mind has come back and it's muttering away in the background. So, but the volume right down. I thought I'd be gladder.
I mean, don't underestimate the layers of the onion, so to speak, and how things sort of change gradually. And it sounds like, what you described sounds significant. The fact that there isn't a sense that this is enough in a way, like or that there is a flatness. It's like, really, is this it? Is this it? That indicates to me that there is still a layer of subtle suffering, like boredom, for example, can be a very subtle layer of suffering that we don't see, and yet it takes the shine off our being because it's sort of like a wet blanket still. But it's nowhere near the same as the suffering that we're used to, let's say, that is noticeable as suffering. And so if someone was to say there's a flatness here, I'd say, well, that's not how it would be described if there was no suffering. And so therefore there is probably a layer of suffering that isn't being seen. And so it's good enough to know that there probably is a layer of suffering, and in time that will either come to the surface so that it's more noticeable, or it will fade away. And it's quite likely that this phase will shift and you'll go through a flip-flopping phase. So there's lots of change that's bound to happen.
Thank you very much for your time. That's fantastic. And I'm with the other lady. I'd really like to see this, because I could hear the discussion. It sounded really, really interesting, but I couldn't get into it because I was so worried about the money that's going, the Zoom, that the person who's hacking your Zoom account. I was fretting about it, so I couldn't really listen properly, but I could tell that it was very interesting.
Oh, is there someone hacking?
Okay.
Is that
you made an announcement when you came on about something in Zoom and I only half heard, and I thought, oh God, I hope it's all right.
Well,
Do you remember saying that at the beginning, or was I dreaming?
No, I did. I'll say it again just for anyone who might have joined. Anyone can join the Zoom meeting, and sometimes I think that modern day scams evolve, and so it could be that some participants may present themselves as being administrators or something like that and asking for money, etc., and that's not part of the Zoom requirement. So if you see that happening, question it. You're more than welcome to donate if you want through the website, but it's not a requirement to be part of the Zoom.
My donations would have arrived. My donations got there, and I'm glad. I just thought maybe they'd been diverted off into the stratosphere somehow. Okay.
No,
Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
And for your talks. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks. Hi, Charlie.
Hi, Roger.
Hello.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I was wondering about the sense of me-ness of being a doer, a person, and I've noticed that it's become more and more subtle, and sometimes it doesn't seem like it's operating in the thinking mind. Mm-hmm. But there's still a feeling that I'm a person.
Yeah, I definitely think feel like I'm a person, and I think we are. I don't think that's going to go anywhere.
I guess I mean the sense of the suffering related to being a person, or the sense of doership of is it? And I think you've maybe covered it in the last question, but to sort of get to the root of this feeling, is it necessary to not just rest in the being, but to do this investigation at the mind level?
I think
that makes sense.
I think that that investigation into the concepts of doership and is underestimated, and it's downplayed because, as I said, there is sometimes a need to find that dimension that is blocked by thinking, right? The resting in being or accessing being. If we're trying to think our way into that or understand what is meant by being. So when we don't feel connected, or we don't have access to that being, and we hear talks about rest in being, you are, I am, awareness, consciousness, the faculty that we have to rely on is our thinking. We try to think and understand what is being said, and actually what's being pointed at is a being outside of thinking. And so, rightly so, teachings will discourage any conceptualizing or thinking because it can get in the way of meeting that consciousness or dropping into being consciousness. And at the same time, even though that can be helpful and is helpful, is needed, too much of it can mean that some other aspects get seen as, are related to by the seeker as no, that's not helpful, which can include, conceptualized or contemplating along the line of some concepts that are pointers, really. And so I think essentially the process will take you where you need to go, because it will mean someone won't resonate with the concepts, and so they will be ardent resters in being, and that is very good. And then at some point, there might be more willingness, more capacity to hear concepts, maybe to hear concepts and not disconnect from the being, and then investigate the concepts in a way that might not have been able to happen previously. So I really do see that it's very easy for the seeking process to not go as far as I know it can, and a lot of the time it's because the working mind hasn't received practical pointers. It's the system has received a lot of esoteric pointers, which I'm not saying the esoteric pointers are not useful. They're very useful. They're needed, and yet the other is also needed. So this whole seeking thing is a bit tricky, in that it's a lot of undoing, and we don't really dictate how the process of undoing works. So once again, we're being taken on this journey. But I would say that without getting into the practical and coming back down to earth and looking at the thinking and seeing, actually, what I'm really looking for is not necessarily liberation or enlightenment as a metaphysical event, but peace of mind in daily living. And we can really remain disconnected from that. And so that sort of thinking, at a certain point, I think, really needs to come in, and it undoes certain patterns that otherwise remain intact.
That's really helpful, because I feel like I have this idea of, this extraordinary experience of having an experience of universal consciousness, and I feel like that idea gets in the way of like what you say, of just actually what I want is the peace.
And that's why being a person isn't a problem. It's a person with the beliefs in doership that cause suffering for the person. That's the problem. And because that set of beliefs of doership and attachment to outcomes are so ingrained and essentially the only movement that happens, teachings can refer to that as the person, which is the way that the person arises when those patterns are in place. And so some teachings will talk about the end of the person, which really means the end of the belief in doership and attachment to outcome. And when we hear that, especially when it's coupled with what you are is awareness, you are consciousness, you are not the body, we imagine a state. We are waiting for a state when I will know myself as formless awareness, not the body, and the person has dissolved, which is what the teachings say. So it makes complete sense that a seeker is going to have these expectations, these desires for a metaphysical event. It's just part of the dangers that are inevitable in the seeking, and those teachings need to say what they need to say because that undoes certain structures. And then we just have to rely on other teachings coming in to sort of tidy up some things or set some other things straight, which is not to say that the teaching that comes in is better, because the teaching that comes in to tidy up or set some things straight isn't doing the bit that the other teaching did, which was necessary. So once again, to me, teachings just dovetail in with each other and support each other and are all necessary. But as far as my experience after having all of the awakenings to what I thought I really was, I had an awakening to consciousness. And when I went to see Ramesh, that's how I presented, is like what I really am is consciousness, what I really am is awareness. And he sort of said to me, Roger, don't be ridiculous. You are Roger. And I thought, what's going on? It's taken 4 or 5 years for me to awaken to being consciousness and to not know myself or not identify as Roger. And here Ramesh is, I've gone to see him, and he's telling me that my knowing myself as awareness is an error, essentially, is don't be ridiculous, you are Roger. And I thought, he might not know, or he might be confused, because at the time it wasn't an intellectual thing, it was based on a qualitative shift in the experience. What I then came to accept, because of what he said, is that, maybe the person that still exists, not the person that still exists and shouldn't exist, but the person that always will exist, has awoken to an aspect of themselves, the awareness, the consciousness aspect, and because that hasn't been seen before, now it's being seen, and how it has come to be seen is by a teaching saying you are not the body. And so then that aspect is seen, and we say, I am that. And who is saying I am that might actually be the person that still exists, but has awoken to an aspect of themselves. And so essentially Ramesh was saying, you are Roger, but you are not the doer of your actions, and your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And that was the beginning of an integration where it hit me at some point that maybe I'm Roger that is deluded and convinced that he is consciousness. And as I thought about it and saw how certain beliefs were put in place because of the teachings I was exposed to before, which I was very happy, and still am very happy to have been exposed to, because they are what led to the awakening of the consciousness aspect, then it occurred to me why those errors had been made, and I saw that they were beliefs, and that's when an integrating back into being human, which I always had been, could happen. And that integration meant what was left was a human being, but no longer with the belief in doership and attachment to outcome, and a human that was also aware of the consciousness aspect as well as the more physical and transitory aspects, such as emotions and thoughts and the body that comes and goes and gets older and changes and has pleasure and pain. And that consciousness aspect is a grounding, it's a home, it's a place that we can always return to and maybe even live from. So hopefully that's what people listening to these teachings get, because I have no doubt that seekers are also listening to a myriad of other teachings, including the top-down esoteric awakening teachings, which I would encourage. And the magic of it all is that we tend to, in the end, hear exactly what we need to hear, exactly when we need to hear it.
Yeah, that was really, really, really interesting. I've never seen it like that before, so thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for dropping in. Hi, Sean.
Good morning, Roger. Thank you so much again for taking all of our questions. It's very generous of you, taking your time and making such a palpable, that's not easy to say, palpable difference in my life anyway. I wanted to ask you, I understand intellectually the concept of doership and how obvious that is after a while watching. You can figure that out, that I'm not the doer and nobody else is either. And sometimes there's a temptation to blame life, because it's life's, we're like, well, life is the doer. Life is doing it. I'm not doing anything. And then you go, well, what? And I understand it's really just an addiction to outcomes is the problem, dissatisfaction with circumstance in the first place. But I just would love to hear you talk about that a little bit, not blaming life.
Yeah, I think it's also an addiction to doership in one form or another. It's like, okay, if I'm not the doer, someone else has to be the doer. Life, I at least I'll have someone to blame, which is really what we want. Is why we jump. Often we want to blame the other. It's always the other's fault or my fault. And so if we stop blaming the other or me, then that habit might morph into, okay, I'm going to blame God. And if we, I received questions some time back from a couple of people saying, I'm now blaming God for everything. And my response is that the God that you are blaming just doesn't exist in the form that you are imagining in the blame. So if you're blaming God, you have to have an image of God, right? The God that you are blaming. And that image of God isn't what God really is. And so even if we shift from God to life, so by saying life, it means that you most likely don't have a God image of a someone. The question is, what are you referring to by life? Because if you look at life, if your idea of life is as how I would hold the word life, which is really a whole set of impersonal forces, like gravity, for example, it doesn't make sense to blame gravity because it's completely impersonal. It's like blaming blaming the tree for dropping a limb, a branch onto your car. We know, our thinking knows that doesn't, you can't blame, you might go blame the council, let's say, for not cutting the tree limb in time. And that's just our blaming tendency. When we see life in a very impersonal sense and there is no controller, then it doesn't make sense to blame life. It's just that's how the impersonal unfolding happens. So I would suggest that your notion of life when you blame life has a notion of some sort of conscious, cognitive, controlling force that is doing this in a very particular way rather than a set of impersonal forces.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it really doesn't make any sense. And you think about, well, all of these dominoes have fallen and it's not personal and everything is happening because it's happening this way. Mm-hmm. And then I think and you're absolutely right. It's a tendency towards blame. Then I might think, oh, but why do I have to be in this position? Why do I have to be the subject of these impersonal forces that end up because I'm dissatisfied with whatever's happening here. And again, we're back to me and I and my situation and my judgment of my situation. Mm-hmm. And
attachment to outcomes, yes, like you had said. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Things should be a certain way. They're not that way. They're this way. And well, whose fault is it? Well, mm-hmm. Nobody's. It's not anybody's fault, and it's actually okay. Like maybe it's not that bad if you put your energy towards that direction of what is it that's bothering you about your situation, mm-hmm. and how can we move forward towards something different if that's what you want to move forward to. But absolutely. I mean, it's kind of fascinating that compulsion to blame. That's it exactly. Mm-hmm. Someone's got to be at fault. It's not me. That makes a lot of sense. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Pleasure. Okay, looks like this is the last question. Oh, there wasn't one more? That was it? Oh, that was the last question. Thank you, everyone. Peace for now.